Hello friends, you would recall that in our last discussion we had talked about the public sector enterprises in India, and today now is the time for us to discuss the private sector enterprises. Basically, private sector is that part of economy which is controlled by the private capital, and businesses in which majority control is held by private individuals. Majority control, you know that it is basically referring to having more than 50% of the share ownership. So if the 50% of more of the share ownership is held by the private individuals, then that particular business can be said to be belonging to the private sector. And you also know that private sector enterprises, they are a very dominant feature in a capitalist economic system. However, since mixed economic system has elements of both capitalist economic systems and the command and control economic systems, in the mixed economic systems you also find presence of private sector enterprises. As far as private sector enterprises in India is concerned, we can categorize the private sector enterprises in India on two bases. The first basis is whether they belong to the organized sector or to the unorganized sector. To understand what basically is organized sector and what basically is unorganized sector, you can refer to my earlier discussion. We had discussed the difference between the two earlier also. So now let me straight away jump into what all organized sector enterprises are there in India which belong to private sector. So as I said, the private sector enterprises can be basically categorized into organized and unorganized. So organized basically is referring to the corporate industrial sectors, which includes Tata, Reliance, Jindal, Adani's, Wipro, Cafe Coffee Day, V-Mart, Vishal Mega Mart. So all these enterprises, basically they are in the organized sector. As far as the unorganized sector is concerned, if you look at it, you would find that almost all the farmers which are engaged in agriculture or allied activities, they are basically part of the unorganized sector, and they contribute a lot to the private sector in India. Almost all of the agriculture here in India is managed privately, and it is managed by private capital. Almost all of it belongs to the private sector. As far as the trade is concerned, the small retailers that you have in your neighborhood, the neighborhood Pachunwala, the retail store owner, there are almost 6 crore such retailers here in India, and all of them belong to the private sector. They are all private enterprises. And then if you look at the small scale and cottage industry sector, almost all of them basically belong to the private sector in India. You can talk about the small scale and cottage industries which you have here in Pithoragarh. Almost all of them, be it Pithoragarh, be it in Uttarakhand, or be it in the whole country, almost all of them belong to the private sector. So this is one way in which you can categorize the private sector here in India. The other basis would be whether the nationality is Indian or foreign. So if the nationality is Indian, we can call it the domestic segment of the private sector, which includes all those private sector enterprises which are owned by Indian nationals. So examples are Mahindra & Mahindra, Sahara Group, Infosys, Parle, Airtel, Bajaj. And again, the neighborhood Kirana Wala, the neighborhood retail shop owner, again, if you start categorizing in this particular fashion, domestic or national, that particular individual or that particular shop would fall in the domestic category. So these are just some of the examples. There are n number of such examples, you can think of them, and in fact you might be knowing already about a lot of them. So these are just examples. This is just an indicative list. This is no way an exhaustive list. Again, the private sector, the other segment would be the foreign segment, which means that the ownership is with some foreign nationals. So we have so many examples of such private sector enterprises also here in India. Amazon is one, the Hong Kong and Shanghai Bank of China, then Hyundai, which is in basically in the automobile industry, LG, consumer durables, Samsung, consumer durables, Paytm, and then we have Hindustan Unilever Limited, which is in the FMCG space. So these are the two bases on which you can categorize the private sector in India. Now let us talk about the role that private sector in India has to play. The first important contribution of private sector is to the economic development of the country. Some reports, some studies estimate that almost 3/4 of the GDP, almost around 75-76% of the GDP is contributed. 75% of the Indian GDP is contributed by the private sector. So this is the extent of their influence, and this is the extent of their contribution to the Indian economy. Now, as far as employment generation is concerned, almost 90% of the jobs are in private sector here in India, which means hardly 10%. In fact, the figure might be a little lower also. So it could be somewhere around 7-8% jobs in the public sector. So the remaining jobs are there in the private sector only. Again, another way in which the private sector contributes to the Indian economy is by investing in the Indian economy for the long term, which we call the capital investment. Naturally, for example, I'll give you an example. Very recently, Samsung it set up its production plant in Noida, and then you have examples of so many private sector enterprises like Parle, Ashoka Leyland, Mahindra and Mahindra, Bajaj. Many of them have set up their factories and production plants in Uttarakhand also, in the Sitkul area, Rudrapur, Udham Singh Nagar. So this is one more role that is played by the private sector capital, private sector enterprises. They invest in machinery, they invest in cutting edge technology, they invest in land and machinery, and this basically complements the investment made by the government. So the investment that they make is another contribution played by the private sector. Then many of the private sector enterprises, they are dependent on raw material, they are dependent on the small scale industries and cottage industries for their raw material requirements. For example, if you talk about Parle produces biscuits, and it produces beverages also, fruit based beverages also. So basically they will have to procure raw material, in which they would procure from the local farmers in the vicinity. So basically they are sourcing not only from small scale industries, but they are also sourcing from the farming community, they are also sourcing from the agriculture community. So in that sense, they provide a source of revenue generation for the small scale industries as well as the farmer community. I have not mentioned farmer community, you can note it down in your copy. If you talk about Ashoka Leyland, we had visited around some 1.5-2 years ago, and you would know that Ashoka Leyland basically is one assembler of automobiles. But to assemble the automobiles, you require parts, and they purchase auto parts from various ancillaries. So basically they are providing them, Ashoka Leyland is providing its ancillaries, its the other small scale industries in the vicinity, an avenue for revenue generation by selling to Ashoka Leyland basically. So this is another role that is played by the private sector, and you would understand that this role was also played by the public sector in India. Again, private sector contribute a lot to our foreign exchange earnings by way of exports. So the private sector enterprises manufacture a lot of products, and they also export quite a significant number of items and in quite significant volumes, and in that sense they help us earn a lot of foreign exchange, and which of course will keep our current account balance in a favorable position. As far as Infosys is concerned, this is a very common example. Infosys, in fact, rather than talking about Infosys, we can talk about the whole software services sector, which is again private sector here in India. So all these companies which provide software products and services, including Infosys, including TCS, and including Wipro, most of these companies, they are selling their services in foreign countries. They are providing services and products to foreign countries, and in that sense they are able to earn us a lot of foreign exchange. So that is another role played by the private sector here in India. Then naturally the private sector enterprises which are profitable, naturally they are going to be taxed also by the government. They have to pay the corporate tax, and there are some few other taxes. For example, earlier we used to have sales tax, and so a number of tax were there. Now that has all been included under the goods and services tax. So the private sector enterprises do not only pay the corporate tax on their earnings, but they also pay the goods and services tax and some other taxes which are still there. So in that sense they help the government earn some revenue, and they also help the government earn something so that the government can later on spend in providing services to the citizenry. So in that sense, again, private sector play a very, very important role in the Indian economy. Now, again, they complement the government efforts in fulfilling customer needs. For example, if you look at the consumer goods industry, there is almost no government presence in the consumer goods industry, because again, this is not a very basic or necessity. This is not a basic industry. This is not a strategically important industry. We have talked about this in the earlier discussion. And it is again not producing a very necessity kind of product. For example, shampoos are not necessary at all. For example, toothpaste, I mean, they are not necessary. They are not necessary for the survival as such. And that is why we are saying that they are not basic necessities. And in such some non-basic industries, government has restrained itself from investing. Government had always had limited resources, and they thought that the best use of those resources would be in the basic necessity industries or in the strategically important industries. So there was no such investment by the government in consumer goods industries, and no, or let us say minimal investment, and that is why it has now been left for the private sector to fill up the gap and to provide the customers these kind of products, and to invest in consumer goods industry and to provide the customers these kind of products, which of course are not necessities, but still they help improve the standard of living of the people. So this gap was filled up by the private sector enterprises, private sector capital. As far as the telecommunication sector is concerned, you would recall that in 90s we used to have only BSNL, and there used to be almost no, in fact there were none of the private sector enterprises. We only used to have BSNL at that point of time. But now if you look at the whole scenario, we have BSNL and we have MTNL, but then the majority of the customers are being served by private sector enterprises, which includes Vodafone Idea after the merger, which includes the Reliance Jio, and which includes Airtel India. So they are filling up the gap which has been left by contraction in public sector investment. So wherein the government investment contracted, as in the case of telecommunication and education and health also, you would now see around so many private hospitals, private medical facilities have come up. In your own town you would find so many private individuals running their own dispensaries. In urban centers you would find big hospital chains, including Max, including Fortis. So private sector has basically chipped in where the gap was left behind by contraction in the public sector investment. Again, as far as education is concerned, till around 30-40 years back, there was the presence of private sector was minimal. Most of the education institutions were basically in the public sector. They were owned or controlled and managed by the government. But slowly the space now has been left for, and it has been provided to the private sector also. Private sector enterprises are coming up, chipping in. In your vicinity only in Uttarakhand you would find so many such private sector institutes, which are being run by private capital. So basically private sector has basically chipped in where the government investment contracted. So that is another complementary role that they have played in Indian economy. And again, private sector is basically known for efficient operations. For them, the mool mantra, the basic mantra is to be efficient. For them, performance is the most important thing. If you are performing in a private sector enterprises, you might get bonuses, you might get promotions. On the other hand, if you are not promoting, you might be the senior most individual, but you would not be promoted. So the basic idea for them is to promote efficiency, to promote good performance, excellent performance, and that is why they tend to be relatively more efficient than most of the government-led enterprises, most of the public sector enterprises. So the role for them is to run their operations in a more efficient manner. Then what generally happens in the public sector organizations, to provide quality management skills, managerial skills, and to innovate a lot so that they can edge out the competition in whichever market they are competing. So if you look at Ashoka Leyland, if you look at Mahindra & Mahindra, you would find that they are market leaders in so many different markets, including in the Western Europe and American markets. So they are among the market leaders there, which means they must have innovated also. They must have regularly kept coming up with innovations, improving their products, and that is why they have been able to do well in those markets which are considered to be relatively very, very difficult markets in terms of innovations, in terms of technological capabilities, in terms of competitive intensity. So the point is that most of the private sector in India, basically the role that has been assigned to them is to keep on innovating, keep on bringing up new technology, keep on using the most cutting edge technology, keep on bringing up new products and new features. So that is another role which has been assigned to the private sector here in India. Okay, now let us talk about some of the limitations which are there with the private sector, because of course there is a lot of contribution that is being made by the private sector in the Indian economy, but then there are some issues also, some limitations also. Number one issue that has become a very talked about in the last few years is the loan defaults by the private sector enterprises. Recent examples are Rotomac Industries, which used to bring these Rotomac pens in the market. Then we had Kingfisher. You know about how Kingfisher has defaulted on the loans that they had taken from a consortium of banks, and ultimately the airlines had to be wound down. The Kingfisher Airlines had to be closed. So loan default is one major problem with the private sector in the recent times. Then we have overemphasis on the low priority industries. Private sector generally invests less in strategically important or those industries which are important for the economy of the country, which are more important for the economy of the country. For example, they would invest less in infrastructures. For example, they would invest less in power production infrastructure, road construction. I'm not saying they would not invest, I'm saying the level of investment would be much less, and they would rather be prioritizing low priority industries which are not very important, which are not fulfilling any basic need. For example, we have talked about the consumer goods industry. And the reason is very simple, because most of the infrastructure projects or strategically important projects, number one, the public sector has already invested in such sectors. And the second reason is that generally these kind of projects are basically long gestational project, and the private sector does not want to run that kind of risk, does not want to be running that kind of risk by investing in a project which will start earning after a long time, a long gestational project. So they generally do not invest in such kind of sectors, and the priority is on those industries or on producing those products or services which are not very, very basic, or which are not very, very necessary for the survival as such. So example can be quoted of the television or the perfumes and cosmetics. You understand that they are not basic, they are not necessary for our survival, but the private sector enterprises, they accord great priority to such products and such industries. Again, now if a private sector enterprise invests in perfumes, let's say it invests in gels, it needs to tell the customer that the gel is important. product and that the customers should be purchasing gel, because otherwise then they would not be able to expand their sales, they would not be able to increase their sales. And that is why they make the customer think that a product which is otherwise not a necessary product for the survival of the customer, they make him perceive the product as very, very central to his existence, very, very important to his existence. And this way they engender consumerism. We have discussed what consumerism is: tending to spend money on those items which are not very important for your survival, but perceiving them to be important for your survival. For example, spending money on, let's say, Coca-Cola. It's not important for your survival, but then we believe that unless until we are having a Coca-Cola bottle in our hand, we would not be able to enjoy the picnic, for example. So that is engendering consumerism in the society. So that is another problem with the private sector in India, and not only in India but in other societies as well. Then they prioritize profit maximization. For them, maximizing the profit is the most important objective. They accord the highest priority to profit maximization, and this actually leads to exploitation of workers. Hire and fire is common as far as the private sector enterprises is concerned here in India. You would know that after 2020 COVID-19 that we know, so many workers lost their job. Why? Because the owners of the enterprises, they were not able to do their business because of the lockdown, and they were not able to earn much, so they simply asked their workers to leave. They simply terminated the services of their workers. So this is what we basically mean by hire and fire. Whenever you are suffering losses in the market, when you are not able to earn significant revenues in the market, when the business is not doing well, they tend to terminate the services of the employees. So in that sense, they exploit the workers. In fact, there are other instances of exploitation of workers also. For example, many a times contract workers are employed because in case of contract workers, you don't have to pay them provident fund, you don't have to worry about their other facilities. For example, providing them paid leaves, like providing them leave on a holiday and paying them also. So that is what a paid leave is. For example, if a government teacher is there, he is not working on Sunday, but he gets paid for that Sunday also. That is a paid leave. So in private sector, you would find that many times they employ contract workers because contract workers don't have to be given paid leaves. So the contract worker is only going to be paid on the day when he arrives for the work and when he actually works. So if he is not coming for work on Sunday, or Sunday because of Sunday not being a working day, or because of Sunday being a holiday, he is not going to be paid for it. So basically, as far as the private sector enterprises are concerned, they hire more of contract workers, because in case of contract workers, their expenditures are much low. They don't have to provide for the provident fund, they don't have to contribute for the employee provident fund, they don't have to provide services, they don't have to give paid leaves. So that is why they generally tend to have a greater share of contract workers in their total workforce and less share of permanent workers in their workforce. So this is also some kind of exploitation. Then just because of this tendency to maximize profit, there are so many industrial disputes which happen. The management focuses on profit maximization. They are not concerned with the well-being of the workers, and then it ultimately leads to a conflict between the workers and the management. One example I can quote is of Maruti Suzuki, wherein in Maruti Suzuki almost 3 to 4 years back, there was a big conflict which took place between the workers and the management, and that ultimately led to the accidental death of one of the employees in Maruti also. So these kind of industrial disputes are also caused many a times by this tendency of the private sector enterprises to maximize their profit at the cost of well-being of the workers. Then there are corrupt practices also. So many private sector enterprises have been found guilty of indulging in corrupt practices. Satyam, for example, it was reported, and that happened around 2009-10. It came to be known that Satyam has basically misreported the profits, and it was basically duping all the regulatory bodies and duping all the shareholders. And when it came to light, within a month of that, the share prices of Satyam, they felt like anything. For example, I remember that they fell to almost rupees 10 from a high of rupees 80. So that these are the kind of corrupt practices which are being witnessed as far as the private sector enterprises in India are concerned, and that is something that is not good for the image of the whole private sector in India. Again, many a times private sectors enterprises, they are more concerned about the profit maximization, and so they tend to degrade the environment also. Many bottling plants here in India, the non-alcoholic beverage bottling plants, for example the Coca-Cola bottling plants and PepsiCo bottling plants, they have been found to extract a lot of water from the ground without worrying about the water requirements of the people living in the vicinity. So this is one way, this is one example how these private sector enterprises are degrading the environment, at times deliberately and at times unknowingly. In Uttarakhand, you have examples of hotels who let their waste straight into some river which is flowing nearby. If you talk about the Char Dhams which are there in India, which are there in Uttarakhand, you would find so many hotels, they empty their waste in the rivers, in the holy rivers, and ultimately polluting the river. So basically they go on to pollute the river. So these are the kind of practices which are degrading the environment, and naturally that is again one of the limitations as far as the role of private sector in India is concerned. Now let us talk about the problems that the private sector enterprise in India face. Regulatory delays, this is one major problem that they face. One example is, in fact, only recently we have improved our position as far as ease of doing business is concerned. Now we have risen to somewhere around 67th position. Earlier we were ranked 113, 120th. So this actually shows that the private sector has to face a lot of problem while doing their business here in India. Another example is why still, despite India having improved its position in the ease of doing business, still almost 50 days are required on an average. Now this is an average figure when property has to be registered. So if you have to register a property, if a private enterprise has to register a property, it requires almost 50 days, and this is an average figure. So this is an average figure for the sample of private sector enterprises from which this data was collected. And if there is a commercial dispute, the resolution would take almost 4 years. So if unfortunately you get entangled as a private sector enterprise, you get entangled into some kind of a commercial dispute, it will take around 4 years for you to be able to resolve that dispute and to get a final ruling on that particular dispute. So these are the kind of regulatory delays that the Indian private sector enterprises have to face. Then there is a complex web of rules and regulations which they have to adhere to, because if they don't, then there might be court cases against them, there might be regulatory actions against them. For example, in manufacturing industries, there are almost 50 labor laws that they have to adhere to, and at times it has been estimated that almost 200 state labor laws are also there. So you have to adhere to minimum of 50 central labor laws if you are in the manufacturing sector. So, and naturally you would understand, not only this, you may have to maintain 10, 15, 20 different registers. You may have to file returns on maybe a monthly basis or maybe on a quarterly basis, at times on a weekly basis. So these are the kind of complex rules and regulations that the private sector has to adhere to, and which is at times very, very difficult. Even if a private sector enterprise does not want to violate a particular law, at times they might actually violate the law, not deliberately, but out of confusion born because of sheer complexity that we have, or sheer volume of laws and regulations that are there. Then the regulatory environment is also unstable. What do we mean by this? basically there is a constant change in policies, government policies, and the constant change in various provisions, constant change in the directives by the regulatory bodies. One example I can quote is of the Bharat Stage 6 norms. Earlier they were to be implemented little later, and then this current government decided that the implementation deadline should be brought forward, and finally now we have got Bharat Stage 6 norms shall be implemented much earlier than what was declared some 10 years ago. Now, which means basically that the automobile firms and the firms which are in the business of retailing automobile fuels, they will have to gear up to adjust themselves to this change in the government policy. So this is what I mean by saying the unstable regulatory environment. The regulations keep on changing, so there is no stability. So a policy which is there today may or may not exist 2 years down the line, and this increases risks for the private sector enterprises here in India, and then they find it more risky to operate here in India. Again, there are so many disputes which take place with tax authorities. For example, I can recall this very recent dispute in the telecommunication sector. The companies did their own calculation of how much tax they have to pay, and they paid that much tax, but the tax authorities came back saying that the calculation is wrong, and in the companies have basically under presented their revenue earnings, and so they will have to pay more as tax. And then this conflict went to the court, and the court gave a final hearing, and now the telecom companies including Vodafone, Idea and Airtel, they have to pay much greater amount as their tax under the adjusted gross revenue dues head. So this has happened, and there are so many other cases where this has happened in the past also, and that is why many a times this term we commonly hear, which is the tax terrorism. So all these issues, they again cause problems for the private sector here in India. Again, the access to credit at times can be difficult, specifically for those entities which are not very big ones. They do not have the backing of big corporate houses. They have the business volume is small. The medium small enterprises in fact face a lot of problem in accessing credit from the bank, and that is why government came up with so many schemes to ensure easy flow of credit, not only to small scale industries but also to large corporate houses. So this is another problem. Then there are infrastructure bottlenecks. The roads are not in a great shape here in India. At times you do not have good transportation network. The cargo trains through which the private enterprises, they generally sell their products, they send their products, they ship their products. The cargo trains generally get late, and they take a lot of time in transporting the products. So these are all infrastructure bottlenecks which ultimately go on to increase the cost of operations, and overall profits for the private sector enterprises decline. So this is one major problem that is there in India. And for example, if you take example of the ports that we have here in India, you would find that they are not able to cater to the demand. So for example, if some private sector enterprises, they want to ship their products out of a particular port, the port may not be able to handle that kind of demand, handle that kind of cargo load, because of which the cargo which has been shipped by these firms, the cargo which has been sent by these firms remains held up at the port for a long period of time. Again, this increases the cost of operations, and that is ultimately detrimental to their prospects. Again, another major problem that is there in India is that the private sector is also finding it difficult to gain easy access to skilled workforce. In fact, one of the study found out that out of 100 degree holders here in India, 77% did not have the skill that is required to gain that degree. So for example, out of 100 engineering and management graduates which were surveyed, it was found that only 23% have these skills to be able to get recruited by a private firm. Remaining 77%, though they were engineers or they were MBA or BBA graduates, they didn't possess the required skills. So this is the kind of dearth of skills that the private sector enterprises here in India are facing. And this means the implication for the private sector is that they will have to spend a lot in training the fresh employees, training the fresh candidates that have just been recruited by the firm, which again is a big cost for them and ultimately is again detrimental to their profits. So these are the problems that the private sector enterprises in India are facing. So now in this particular discussion we talked about the role of private sector, we have talked about how important they are for the economy of the country, and we have also talked about the limitation with the private sector enterprises, and we are ending this discussion with a brief overview of all the problems that the private sector enterprises here in India have to face. In the next discussion that we'll have, we will move on to the cooperative sector.